Here's a guy who thinks he has an argument that ends atheism.
Atheism is a rapidly growing ideology, and according to statistics, that is not going to change anytime soon. You see, atheism in today's society, people view it as something that is closely associated with intellectualism, with enlightenment, with rationality, as breaking out of these chains of ancient barbaric slavery, ancient barbaric worldviews and ideologies that we no longer need, that we should leave in the past. These things are for uneducated people, for dumb people, for people that are not smart enough. But that could not be further from the truth.
Wait, you mentioned slavery. Are you saying it's not true that slavery is a part of religion, or that it's not true that slavery isn't a good idea?
What I will present for you today is a simple yet powerful argument that if you understand it properly, you will never ever struggle again with the rationality of the existence of God.
If the argument says that there has to be a creator which exists independent of time and space, I'm pretty sure I will.
You don't need to be Aristotle or Plato or Plotinus. You don't need to have a master's degree in philosophy. All you need is basic tools of rationality that are intuitive, that you, me, and almost everybody in the world uses on a day-to-day basis. Arguments for the existence of God are split under categories or types of arguments. The most dominant types of arguments for the existence of God are deductive arguments. A deductive argument is where the conclusion necessarily follows from the set of premises. For example, premise number 1, all humans are mortal. Premise number 2, Socrates is a human. Therefore, conclusion, Socrates is mortal.
Insofar as deductive arguments are used to argue for the existence of God, they are always based on premises that are either clearly false or are at best undemonstrated.
You see how the conclusion, Socrates is mortal, necessarily follows without any possible alternative.
Yes, it's a valid argument. The conclusion is true as long as the premises are true. There is, however, no valid deductive argument for God that is based on premises that are indisputably true.
From the set of premises. Now, although these arguments are powerful, you carry a burden with them. That is, the conclusion must be substantiated with absolute certainty, such that no other alternative explanation is possible. And if an alternative explanation is given, therefore the argument fails.
There is no modus ponens argument, which is the kind of argument given in this example, in which the conclusion fails to follow from the premises.
Before we get into the argument, let us establish two basic guiding principles. Principle number 1 will be McCarthy's circumscription. McCarthy's circumscription is just to say that we assume the default, we assume the norm, unless we have good reason to think otherwise.
If a premise of an argument is based on an assumption, then even if the argument is logically valid, it is not proof because it is based on at least one unproven premise.
What does that mean? For example, I could be walking on the side of the road and I look on a tree, and upon the branch of a tree is a bird. Now, the default assumption that I will have is that the bird can fly. Now, if other additional information comes to me, maybe it will cause me to change my assumption that actually the bird can't fly. But the default assumption is that because birds usually fly, this is a bird, therefore the bird can probably fly.
A deductive argument that is based on a premise that is only probably true will produce a conclusion that is, at best, probably true. It will not be proof.
You see, very simple, very intuitive. We know this, we utilize this, we rationalize with this on a day-to-day basis. No philosophical mumbo-jumbo needed, no jumping through hoops, no, Philibro Discord talk.
Yes, people typically make inductive inferences. I don't see how you can use this to end atheism.
Nothing like that. Very simple, very intuitive. Now, the second principle is very related to the first principle, and this is what I call the defeasibility rule of prevalence. Now, what on God's green earth is that? The defeasibility rule of prevalence is just to say that in the world, what we could see, what we could observe, there are things that we could distinguish and identify to be patterns, things that are usually behave certain way or that usually are a certain way, unless there is an exception to that general rule. For example, we observe that the pattern is that the sun rises every day and sets every day. And it's done that as long as the earth and the sun has existed. And so we assume it'll happen tomorrow, the day after, and the day after that. Why? Because we've identified this pattern. So therefore, we assume that things will happen as they regularly happen.
Yes, this is also just inductive inference.
You see, in our world, what is demonstrable is that when things occur, this is the rule of prevalence. When things occur, things are usually explicable. When my phone dies, when my car stops working, when anything happens, we assume that this thing is explicable. Why? Because that is the general pattern that we could demonstrably show to be the case in the world.
But theists commonly make an exception to this principle for God, but will not allow an exception for the universe. There are events in the universe that have no discernible cause, especially but not exclusively at the quantum level. I also think the existence of time and space do not need a cause, nor do I think it's even coherent to say that they have a cause. You can't cause something to exist at a time when it already exists, and obviously there was never a time when time itself did not already exist.
Things usually have an explanation. Now, we're not going to go as far as saying all things that happen must have an explanation. We're not going to do that. Why? Because we're not going to carry that burden. We're not going to cancel that possibility. We'll say, look, things either can be explained, have an explanation, or are just brute. They just don't have an explanation. Sure, we could grant it, no problem. But we assume things are explicable. We don't assume things are inexplicable.
Yes, we assume things have causes, which is why it's entirely reasonable to infer that if a God exists, that a God has a cause. If God does not need a cause, why would the universe?
So now that we've established that propositions and true facts are usually explicable, are assumed to be explicable, unless there's a good reason to think otherwise, the universe exists is a true statement. It's either the universe exists as a statement, is explicable, meaning has an explanation, or inexplicable, meaning has no explanation. The default assumption is that this statement has an explanation. We don't assume it has no explanation.
Now, what reason is there to think that God does not have an explanatory cause?
Unless we have good reason to think otherwise. There is no good reason to think the universe has no explanation. Therefore, conclusion, the universe has an explanation. Very easy, very simple.
And there's the false premise. There is a good reason to think that the universe does not have a cause that explains its existence. The universe is the space-time continuum. Whenever there is time, there is a universe by definition. Since it would be incoherent to create something or cause it to exist at a time when it already exists, and there by definition was never a time when time didn't already exist, space-time per se could never have been created and therefore cannot coherently have a creator.
You see, we didn't have to make any absolutely certain claims. We didn't have to make any crazy assertions. All we did was use basic reasoning tools.
You should have made a bit more of an effort to be certain of the premise that there's no reason to think that the universe has no explanatory cause, because that's actually a very questionable premise.
And we've concluded that the universe has an explanation.
Since one of the premises from which you have drawn this conclusion is dubious at best, so is the conclusion itself.
Now, you may ask, well, Orthodox Muslim, just because the universe has an explanation, it doesn't mean that God is the explanation. You see, your argument doesn't work.
An explanation for the universe that many physicists speculate is possible is that our universe is the result of a black hole in another universe that created this one. If that is possible, that seems like a much more plausible explanation than God. Even this, however, would not be a cause of the existence of space and time per se. I think it would still be incoherent for space and time in and of themselves to have a cause.
Well, luckily for us, the argument isn't quite over yet. There are two kinds of explanations. Either the explanation is contrastive or the explanation is non-contrastive. Well, you may ask, what is a contrastive explanation and what is a non-contrastive explanation? A contrastive explanation is an explanation that explains why X instead of Y. Let's plug in the universe. Why does the universe exist instead of not existing? Or why is the universe this way or not another way?
And the explanation for why space and time per se exist instead of not existing is because they seem to define the boundaries of the very concept of existence. To say that something exists is to say that it has location in space-time. Without space-time, nothing can coherently be said to exist. And I think the idea of complete and total non-existence is not a coherent concept. It seems to be the absence of any kind of concept.
A non-contrastive explanation explains why X only. So let's plug in the universe now. Why does the universe exist? Or why is the universe this way? You see, when it comes to reasoning, we prefer explanations with higher explanatory power that offer a wider explanatory scope, that are more virtuous over explanations that explain less, that are less virtuous.
The reason the universe exists is because its non-existence makes no sense. To ask why it is the way it is instead of some other way assumes that the other ways we can imagine it being are possible. Not everything we can imagine is possible.
Contrastive explanations are more virtuous, they have a higher explanatory scope over non-contrastive explanations. So according to reason, we have no reason to think that the explanation of the universe is non-contrastive. We have all the reason to think that the explanation of the universe is contrastive. Therefore, it is reasonable to say that the explanation of the universe is contrastive. It explains why the universe exists instead of not. It explains why the universe is this way instead of any other way.
The reason it exists instead of not existing is the same as the reason bachelors are unmarried instead of married. It's because the alternatives are incoherent. And God doesn't really explain why the universe is exactly like this as opposed to some other way we can imagine it being. Because even if it's possible for the universe to be in some sense different, to say that it is the way it is because God made it this way and not that way doesn't explain why God made it this way instead of some other way.
Now, the contrastive explanation must be necessary. Well, what does it mean for the explanation to be necessary? Well, all it means is that the explanation exists in every possible world. It cannot fail to exist in any world.
Right, and a universe exists in every possible world because a world without a universe would not be a world at all. It would be the absence of a world.
A contingent or non-necessary existence is an existence that can fail to exist in a possible world.
Which would be true of God and not the universe.
Now you may ask, well, why does the explanation of the universe have to exist in every possible world? Well, the answer is very easy. If the explanation of the universe is contingent, it means that there is at least one world where the universe exists and the explanation does not.
That is true in every possible world. It is a contradiction to say that there is a possible world without a universe because a universe, being a space-time continuum, is that upon which existence itself is contingent. To say that something can exist in a world without a space-time continuum is to say that there is a possible world in which that thing exists nowhere and never, which means the exact same thing as saying it does not exist.
Now, if the explanation does not exist, then it cannot possibly explain the world. Therefore, the contrastive explanation must exist in every possible world in order to contrastively explain the universe. Therefore, there is a necessary explanans that explains the universe, and that is the bare core primitive notion of God.
And that is why that notion is incoherent. It denotes a being that exists, or at least can exist, without the defining characteristics of existence itself, which is spatiotemporal location. To say that something exists independent of space and time is to say it exists nowhere and never, which means that it does not exist. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.